On the night of June 11th, 2004, an EF2 tornado touched down in Township 14 of Dodge County, Wisconsin at 11:45 in the evening and traveled 3 miles along the ground before lifting at 12:10 in the morning. In those 25 minutes, it took 3 barns: the Nowak Dairy Barn, a 1968 pole structure with a gambrel roof and a milk house attached on the south side, gone. The roof lifted first, and the walls followed, and what was left was a concrete foundation and a pile of lumber and roofing tin that would take 2 days just to sort from what was salvageable. Stan Nowak had built that barn himself in 1968 with his father and 2 uncles. He had milked in it every morning for 36 years. In 25 minutes, it was a pile of wood and tin on a concrete pad. The Greer Hay and Equipment Barn, a 1952 timber frame structure, the second dairy barn the Greer family had built on the same spot after the first one burned in 1949. The timber frame was standing, but the roof and 3 walls were gone, and the south wall was bowed outward 6 inches from true, which meant the frame itself was compromised, and the whole structure would need to come down before anything new could go up. Roy Greer had $4,000 of hay equipment exposed to the June Wisconsin sky and a nearly new hay baler sitting in the middle of it getting wet. The Pietila machine shed, a steel building from 1987, was the cleanest loss. The building was simply gone, the anchor bolt still in the concrete slab, the steel panels and purlins distributed across a quarter-mile of neighboring field in pieces too bent to salvage. The concrete was fine. The building was not. Paavo Pietila had 3 tractors and a combine on an open slab with nothing above them, and a long Wisconsin summer ahead of him. 3 farms, 1 night, 40 miles of combined fence and drainage infrastructure to deal with in addition to the structures themselves. Cattle scattered across 2 of the 3 properties. Equipment buried under debris at the Nowak place that would have to be moved before anyone could assess what was salvageable and what was not. At 2:30 in the morning, Ed Bauer got in his truck and drove the loop through Township 14 to see the full damage. He had heard the storm pass. He had walked his own farm at midnight and found a section of fence down and a dozen shingles off the machine shed roof. Minor. He had known from the sound that the township had not gotten off equally light. He drove the loop. He stopped at each farm. He walked the debris fields with a flashlight. He talked to Stan Nowak and to Roy Greer and to Paavo Pietila, all of whom were standing in their farm lanes in the dark, looking at what the night had produced. He did not tell any of them what he was going to do. He made no promises. He gathered the information, walked the debris, and looked at what was salvageable and what was not. He was at the Pietila slab for 45 minutes, walking the edges with the flashlight, counting anchor bolt locations, calculating the square footage that would need to be enclosed, thinking about the steel supply contact in the adjacent township who had been on his cross-referenced contact list since 1994, and who had a standing agreement with Ed about emergency supply priority. At 3:15 in the morning, Ed drove home. He went to the farmhouse. He opened the composition notebook he kept in the desk beside the phone. Not the farm ledger, the other notebook, the one with the 42 names and phone numbers and the skill and equipment notes he updated every January. He looked at the notebook for a moment. He had updated the January entries 5 months ago. The phone numbers were current. The equipment notes were current. The skill designations were current. He ran his finger down the first page to the names he needed first: telehandler, framing lumber, concrete equipment, generator, food coordination, dairy compliance, and started dialing. He started making calls at 3:20. He did not explain. He said, "Tornado took 3 barns, Nowak, Greer, Piatila. We start at the Nowak place at 5. What can you bring?" 38 of the 42 families on the township, 14 roster, answered. Let me tell you about Ed Bauer and the roster, because you need to understand what he had built before you can understand what answered the phone at 3:20 in the morning. Ed had taken the roster from his father Fritz in 1982, when Fritz retired from active farming. Fritz had started it in 1962 when the Schultz barn had burned and the township had organized the rebuild with no prior system and more confusion than necessary. Fritz had decided that next time the township would have a list. The Schultz barn fire of 1962 had not been a complicated emergency. The barn burned. The community came. The barn was rebuilt. But the community had come in the disorganized way of people who care but have not planned. The right tools arrived at the wrong time. The lumber showed up before the foundation was cleared. 3 men spent half a day doing work that 1 man should have done, while the rest of the crew stood waiting for direction. The barn went back up slowly and inefficiently, and with a great deal of goodwill running in all the wrong directions at once. Fritz had watched this and made a decision. A township that responded to a crisis the way Township 14 had responded to the Schultz fire was not ready. Not because the people were not willing. They were. Because willingness without coordination is not a system. It is a crowd. A willing crowd at a farm emergency is better than nothing, but it is substantially worse than a prepared system of 42 families who know their assignments before the emergency begins. He had gone home after the Schultz barn raising and started writing names in the notebook. Not the names of who was willing. He knew everyone was willing in a crisis. He wrote the names of who had what. The telehandler, the framing lumber sitting dry in the barn, the concrete mixer, and the forms. The man who could work a circular saw safely at height without scaffolding. The pickup truck that could run to Beaver Dam and back in 2 hours if a part was needed. He wrote what each family would bring. He arranged it so that in a crisis, the first call told each family what to bring and where, and they arrived with the right thing rather than arriving with their willingness and waiting to be told what to do. He had built the list over the winter of 1962 to 1963, going farm to farm in the slow months, asking each family what they could contribute, what they had, what they would need if the situation were reversed. He had written it all in the composition notebook. He had read the assignments out at the annual township picnic every July, so each family knew their role before there was ever a need for it. He had updated the phone numbers every January. He had told Ed in 1982 when he handed over the notebook, "The list does not cost anything. It costs 1 afternoon in January to update the phone numbers and 1 conversation at the picnic to remind people what they signed up for." He paused. "What it buys is 22 years of knowing your neighbors well enough that at 3 in the morning, nobody has to figure out who to call." He looked at Ed. "Do not let the list lapse. The day the list lapses is the day the township becomes a collection of farms instead of a township." Ed had not let the list lapse. He had updated it every January for 22 years. He had organized 3 barn raisings in those 22 years, Each one completed faster and more efficiently than the one before because each time the system had worked and the participants understood their roles better from having used them. The 1986 Reinhardt Dairy Barn fire had taken 3 days to frame the replacement structure. The crew was learning the system. The 1991 Faber hay barn windstorm rebuild had taken 2 days. The crew was practiced. The 1998 Gruenwald machine shed fire had taken 1 day for the frame, 1 more for the roof and siding. The crew was efficient, each time faster. Each time the families on the roster knew their jobs better because they had done them before. Each time, in the aftermath, a neighbor had told Ed the system was obsolete. Contractors were faster, more professional, insured, code-compliant. The world had moved on from barn raisings. Ed had listened and updated the roster in January. Stan Nowak had been the most consistent voice. He had told Ed in 2000 after the Gruenwald machine shed fire that the township was lucky there was good insurance coverage and that the contractor who finished the electrical and insulation had done a better job than community labor would have. He had said in 2002, "Ed, the mutual aid system is a tradition. Traditions are fine, but a tradition is not a system." He had said, "When the big one comes, you will want a contractor with liability insurance and a building permit, not a list of phone numbers in a composition notebook." Ed had said, "When the big one comes at midnight, I will want people who can be there at dawn." Stan had shrugged. He was not a hostile man. He was an efficient man who believed in modern solutions to farming problems and who thought that community labor was a nice sentiment that had been replaced by better systems. He genuinely believed this. He said it directly and without meanness. He was wrong about it, but he did not know he was wrong in 2002. He would know on the morning of June 12th, 2004. Let me tell you what 42 names in a composition notebook looked like on the morning of June 12th. Because the abstract argument about community systems becomes very concrete when you're standing in a debris field at 5 in the morning. The Wenzel family arrived at 4:45 with a flatbed trailer and a Lull telehandler. They had not needed to be told to bring the telehandler because their assignment on the roster for 11 years had been heavy equipment, specifically the telehandler, and they had run it at 2 of the 3 previous barn raisings. They knew where to position the machine at a debris clearance. They knew how a framing crew worked around it. They did not need instructions on the morning of June 12th. They needed the address which Ed had given them at 322. The Kern family arrived at 5:10 with 2 trucks loaded with framing lumber. 2,000 board feet of 2x6 and 2x8 sitting dry in their barn from a project that had not yet started. Their assignment on the roster was materials supply. They knew to call the lumber yard at 7 for any additional to put it on Ed's account, and to note the quantities for reconciliation with insurance later. They had done this at the Gruenwald fire. The Hoffman family arrived at 5:15 with a concrete mixer and forming panels. Their daughter Ava, a licensed dairy inspector for Dodge County, who had been added to the roster in 1996, specifically because of her credential, arrived with them. Her assignment was dairy compliance. She was there to advise on the temporary milkhouse setup and to communicate with the county inspector about what the temporary configuration needed to include to pass inspection. Ed had put her name in the roster with a specific note: dairy compliance. Dodge County procedures. She had been on the list for 8 years. She knew exactly what she was there for. The Buchholz family had a truck at the Nowak farm at 5:15 before the first timber crew had made its first cut of the day. The truck contained coffee urns, food for 60 people across 2 meals, and a note listing dietary restrictions for crew members that had been on the roster since 1997, when someone at a previous barn raising had a reaction to something in the food. The food assignment was on the roster. The Buchholz family took it seriously. These were not 42 families who had shown up to help. They were 42 families who had shown up to do specific jobs they had been assigned years earlier and had practiced at previous emergencies. The distinction is the difference between a crowd and a system. Let me tell you what the system accomplished and what a contractor would have done instead, because the comparison is specific and the numbers close the argument. A general contractor in Dodge County, Wisconsin, in June 2004, given the job of rebuilding 3 farm structures simultaneously, would have needed to schedule assessment visits on all 3 sites, prepare bid documents for each structure, receive insurance adjuster authorization before beginning, pull building permits from the Dodge County Building Department, which carried a backlog of approximately 2 to 3 weeks on agricultural construction, order materials through standard supply chains with standard lead times, and schedule subcontractors who were already committed to their existing work queues. The fastest reasonable timeline from June 12th to the first new framing going up on any of the 3 structures, 3 to 4 weeks. The fastest timeline to all 3 structures complete, 8 to 12 weeks. This is not a criticism of contractors. It is the timeline that the permitting and scheduling system produces when operating at normal efficiency on 3 simultaneous projects in a county where every storm-damaged job goes to the same pool of contractors at the same time. During those 8 to 12 weeks, Stan Nowak had no milk house. Without the milk house, he could not ship milk. Without shipping milk, he was not running a dairy. Every day he could not ship milk was a day of income permanently lost. The tornado had been an emergency on June 11th. By June 25th, with no contractor yet able to start, it would have become a financial crisis of a different character. Not a barn loss, but an operational collapse. The township had the temporary milk house functional by June 14th, 2 days after the tornado. Ava Hoffman had designed the temporary configuration on the morning of June 12th, communicating with the county dairy inspector while the debris crew was still clearing the Nowak foundation. The inspector came on June 13th. The setup met minimum requirements. Stan was shipping milk by June 15th. He lost 3 days of milk income, approximately $2,800. A 6-week contractor wait would have cost him $56,000 in lost milk revenue alone, before counting the ongoing hay and feed storage losses at the Greer Place and the equipment exposure at Pietila. The Nowak barn framing was complete by June 22nd, the roof on by June 25th. The Greer timber frame came down safely on June 13th, taking most of the day to drop the compromised walls without further damage, and the new frame went up June 15th through 18th. The Pietila machine shed steel erection was complete by June 23rd, using panels ordered by Ed on the morning of June 12th through the supply contact on his cross-referenced roster, a farmer in the adjacent township who ran a steel operation and who had a standing emergency priority agreement with Ed, renewed verbally every 2 years, that he had put in writing in 1994. Total elapsed time from tornado to all 3 structures substantially complete, 12 days. The township had done in 12 days what a contractor system would have needed 8 to 12 weeks to begin. Let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time someone told you that a community system, a roster, a mutual aid agreement, an understanding among neighbors about what they would do for each other in a crisis was obsolete? When was the last time the efficiency argument won the conversation? And do you know today, right now, the name and phone number of the neighbor who would show up at 4:30 in the morning if your barn went down tonight? Ed knew. He had 42 names. Have you ever seen a volunteer fire department arrive at a fire? The firemen do not arrive and figure out what to do. They arrive and do what they have been trained and assigned to do without discussion, because the assignment happened before the fire. The roof crew goes to the roof. The pump operator goes to the truck. The incident commander goes to the corner where the incident commander always goes. They can do this in a fire because they did it 100 times in training before any fire arrived. Ed's roster was the same principle applied to farm structures. The Wenzel family had done 3 telehandler jobs at previous Township 14 barn raisings. By June 12th, they did not need direction. They needed the address. That is what 22 years of maintenance produced. Not a miracle, an address. Stan came to Ed at the end of the Nowak barn project on June 25th, when the roof was on and the permanent milk house was running. He had worked alongside the township crew every day of the 12 days, on a framing crew 3 days, running the telehandler another, helping Piatila clear anchor bolt channels on the slab on a third. He was the kind of man who did not stand to the side when work needed doing, even when it was work that proved he had been wrong about the people doing it. He found Ed at the truck, closing the composition notebook after the final day's coordination notes. "Ed," Stan said. Ed looked up. Stan said, "I said contractors were faster." Ed said, "You did." Stan said, "I was wrong about that." He paused. I did not understand what faster meant in this context. Faster is not 6 weeks with permits. He looked at the barn behind him. Faster is 12 days with neighbors. Ed said, "Yes." Stan said, "And the roster." He looked at the notebook on the hood. I said it was a tradition, not a system. He paused. I was wrong about that too. A tradition is something you do because your grandfather did it. A system is something that works when you need it to work. He looked at Ed. That notebook is a system. Ed said nothing. He put the notebook in the truck. Stan said, "I want to be on the list properly. I have the telehandler and I have the framing experience. Both of those turned out to matter." He paused. "Put me down for both." Ed opened the notebook. He wrote Stan Nowak's name in the margin of the June 2004 page with his equipment and his skills. He would transfer it to the January page in 6 months. He said, "Welcome to the roster." Stan said, "I'll give you the current cell number in January." Ed said, "I'll call you." Stan drove home. The following July, 61 families came to the township 14 annual picnic. The previous year, 42 had come. The 19 additional were farms that had been on the periphery of the township, connected by geography and history, but never formally on the roster. They had watched June 2004 from the outside and decided they wanted to be on the list. Ed had visited each of them the previous January, as he visited every farm in January and had written down their names and skills and equipment and phone numbers. At the picnic, after Ed finished reading the assignments, Stan Nowak stood up and said to the 61 assembled families, "I told Ed for 2 years that the mutual aid system was a tradition, not a system. The tornado proved me wrong." He paused. "When your barn goes down at midnight, the question is not whether your insurance is good. The question is who shows up at dawn." He looked at Ed across the tables. "I know who showed up at my dawn. It was 40 names in a composition notebook." He sat down. The picnic went on. Ed updated the roster in January of 2006. 61 names. Skills noted. Equipment noted. Phone numbers verified. The Wenzel telehandler was still on page 1. Stan Nowak's telehandler and his framing experience were on page 3. His cell number was current. He had called Ed in December to give it to him without being asked. Let me tell you the last thing, because it is the thing Fritz Bauer would have wanted you to know. Fritz had started the roster in 1962 because the Schultz barn fire had shown him that willingness and preparation are not the same thing, and that the time to build a system is not the night the system is needed. He had told Ed, "The day you stop keeping the roster is the day you lose the township." He had said this not as a prediction about a specific tornado on a specific night in 2004, but as a description of how communities work. Communities are not held together by proximity. You can live next to a man for 30 years and not know what he has in his barn or what he can do in a crisis. A roster is the specific practice of finding out before you need to know. Ed had kept the roster for 22 years. He had attended the July picnic every year. He had read the assignments. He had updated the phone numbers. He had done this when the system seemed unnecessary and when it seemed irrelevant, and when his neighbors told him the world had moved on. The world had not moved on from the part where barns go down in the night. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Stories of the lists kept every year through the years when nobody needs them. Of the fathers who understood that the day you stop keeping the roster is the day you lose the township. Of the neighbors who said the old system was a tradition and found out in 12 days what a system actually is. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. Tell me in the comments, does your township have a mutual aid system? When was the last time it was used? The roster is in the composition notebook in Ed's desk. 61 names, updated every January. The Township 14 picnic is every July. The assignments are read out. Fritz said, "The day you stop keeping the roster is the day you lose the township." Ed never stopped. The township is still there. The barns are standing. Stan Nowak's telehandler is on page 3. His cell number is current as of this January. The roster cost one afternoon a year for 42 years. What it bought was 12 days in June 2004, and 3 dairy farms that did not lose their season, and a neighbor who drove to Ed's farm in December to give him a phone number without being asked, because he was on the list now and he understood what that meant. Let me tell you about the specific way Fritz built the assignment system, because the design of it is what made it work and what made it worth maintaining for 42 years. When Fritz went farm to farm in the winter of 1962 to 1963, he was not simply collecting phone numbers. He was building a map of the township's capacity. He was asking every family, "What do you have that nobody else on this road has? What is the specific thing you can bring that would be hardest to replace if it were not available. For the Wenzel family, the answer was the telehandler, a piece of equipment that cost more than most farms had available and that was essential for any heavy framing operation. For the Kern family, the answer was the lumber supply relationship. They had a standing account at the beaver dam yard and could place an emergency order and have material on site the same day. For the Hoffman family, the answer eventually became Ava's dairy inspection credential, a piece of paper that in the specific context of a dairy barn loss was worth more than any amount of lumber or labor, because without her, the county inspector's appointment could not be secured for weeks. Fritz wrote these things down. He updated them when they changed. He read them out at the picnic, not as a formality, but as a maintenance practice. By hearing their assignment read out every July, each family was reminded of what they had signed up for and was given the opportunity to say if their situation had changed. If the Wenzel telehandler had been sold, Fritz needed to know. If the Kern lumber account had closed, Fritz needed to know. The July reading was the annual audit of the system's current capacity. When Ed took over the notebook in 1982, he continued the audit exactly as Fritz had run it. He was not sentimental about the practice. He was practical about it. The roster was either current or it was not useful. And if it was not useful, it was not worth the afternoon in January and the conversation in July. Ed kept it current because keeping it current was the only thing that made keeping it worth doing. He had added 19 entries to the roster between 1982 and 2004 as the township's capacity changed and as new families moved in or new skills became relevant. He had removed 11 entries when families retired or sold or moved away. He had updated the dairy compliance note when Ava Hoffman got her county credential in 1996 and had written beside her name, "Call first in any dairy structure emergency." She had not known he had written that. She found out on the morning of June 12, 2004, when Ed called her at 3:28 and said, "Nowak Milk House is gone. I need you to design the temporary setup. Can you be there by 5:30? She had said, "I'll be there by 5. She was. Let me tell you something about what happened in the 48 hours after the tornado that the 12-day timeline does not fully capture, because the 12-day number is the framing and roofing timeline, and the actual response began in the first 2 hours. By 6 in the morning on June 12th, the debris at the Nowak site had been organized into 3 categories: salvageable structural lumber, salvageable hardware and equipment, and landfill material. And the telehandler was moving the landfill piles to the field edge to clear the foundation for the new construction. By 7, Ava had reached the county dairy inspector by phone and had described the temporary milk house configuration she was proposing. By 8, the county inspector had confirmed he would come on June 13th. By 9, Ed had reached the steel supplier in the adjacent township and had ordered the panels for the Piatila shed. By 10, the Greer farm had a crew assessing the compromised timber frame and planning the safe demolition sequence. This all happened in the first 4 to 5 hours after dawn. It happened because Ed had woken up at 3:15 with a composition notebook that told him who could do what, and because the families on that notebook had picked up their phones at 3:20 and 3:22 and 3:25 and said yes before Ed had finished explaining. The 12-day timeline began at 6 in the morning on June 12th. The system that produced the 12-day timeline had been running since 1962. Let me also tell you about the 4 families who did not answer the 320 calls, because this is the part of the story that completes the honest accounting. 4 of the 42 families on the roster did not answer on the morning of June 12th. 1 was on vacation in Michigan, and their phone went unanswered at that hour. They called Ed back at 7 and came that afternoon. 1 had a medical situation in the family that prevented them from coming, and they called to explain and offered to contribute materials instead, which they did. 1 had equipment problems with the truck that morning and came on day 2 with a borrowed flatbed. 1 did not respond at all. Ed did not remove them from the roster. He made a note in the January section that their assignment should be cross-covered, and he called them in December to verify their current situation. A system that only works when everyone responds perfectly is not a system. It is a hope. Ed's roster was built to work when some of the pieces did not come together perfectly on a given morning. The assignments overlapped enough that the 4 missing families left no gap in the June 12th response. The Wenzel telehandler covered the absent heavy equipment family. The Kern lumber covered the absent materials family. 38 families out of 42 was more than enough. Fritz had told Ed about this in 1982, referring to it as the redundancy principle. He said, "You build the list so that every critical function has at least 2 families who can perform it." He said, "The day every family on the list shows up is a good day. The day you need them to all show up to function is a bad design." Ed had maintained the redundancy. The overlap had worked on June 12th the way it was designed to work, quietly, invisibly, without anyone noticing that 4 families were absent because the other 38 had covered the gaps. That is what 42 years of design and maintenance produces. Not a perfect system, a reliable one.